She thought her life was destined to be filled with silence and submission until something changed. Mark's control had turned Emily into a shadow of herself, but that night a small spark of resistance ignited. Now she finds herself on the brink of a decision that could change everything. With her children as her motivation, she prepares to face the unknown. Can Emily break free from Mark's oppressive control before it's too late?
The house was still, shrouded in an eerie silence that had become Emily's constant companion. The ticking of the clock on the living room wall was the only sound, each second echoing louder in her mind. She sat on the edge of the worn couch, hands clenched in her lap, her eyes unfocused as they drifted over the dimly lit room. Mark wasn't home yet. It was past 10, but Emily didn't need to look at the clock to know. She had learned to sense his absence, the heavy space he left behind whenever he was away, whether on business or whatever excuse he had concocted for the night. For years, she had convinced herself that his lateness was just the price she paid for stability. Mark always insisted she wasn't good enough to understand the weight of his responsibilities. He was the provider, the one who kept everything in order. She should be grateful, he often reminded her. And she had been, at least in the beginning. But now, the routine was suffocating her. His words, once persuasive, had turned into chains that bound her spirit, tightening with each passing day. Her thoughts wandered back to their earlier years, the early days when Mark's charm had captivated her. Back then, his criticism felt more like guidance, the push she thought she needed. But now, it was clear, those were the first signs of control. He had slowly chipped away at her confidence, turning even the smallest mistakes into monumental failures. "You can't even cook a simple dinner without ruining it," he had said one night when she accidentally burned a roast. Since then, every meal felt like a test, and she failed most of them in his eyes. The criticisms never stopped, and over time, they became more frequent and more cutting. Emily barely recognized herself anymore. She had stopped trying new things, stopped voicing her opinions, and certainly stopped standing up for herself. She was a shell, moving through the motions of life, pleasing him in every way possible, yet somehow always falling short. Tonight felt like every other night. The weight of his absence hung in the air, a tension she could never quite escape. Her hands trembled slightly as she got up from the couch and walked to the window. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows on the empty road. She knew where he was, or at least she had her suspicions. Mark didn't even bother hiding it anymore. The late nights, the lipstick stains, the way he avoided her touch, it was all so blatant, so cruel. Yet, every time she tried to confront him, he turned the tables, making her feel like the paranoid, unreasonable one. "You're imagining things," he'd say. "I work hard to give you this life, and you sit here doubting me? You should be thanking me." Her breath caught in her throat as she stared out into the night. How many years had she let this go on? How many times had she swallowed the bitterness, telling herself she was doing it for the family, for the children? Mark had always made it clear that she wouldn't survive without him. "You wouldn't last a day out there on your own," he said once, his voice dripping with contempt. But deep down, a small part of her was starting to doubt him. Lately, she'd noticed a shift within herself, a tiny spark of resistance that hadn't been there before. It wasn't enough to act on yet, but it was there, growing, slowly but surely. It flickered in moments when she looked at her children, when they smiled at her, unaware of the storm brewing between their parents. They were her light, the reason she held on for as long as she did. Emily placed her hand gently on the glass, her reflection staring back at her, weary and worn. This wasn't the life she had imagined. The silence in the house felt heavier now, pressing in on her chest. She closed her eyes, letting a long breath escape her lips. She couldn't keep living like this. But the thought of leaving, of confronting Mark, seemed impossible. Where would she go? How would she support her children? These questions kept her trapped, stuck in a life that no longer felt like her own. The sound of the front door creaking open jolted her from her thoughts. Mark was home. His presence filled the room before he even spoke a word. Emily's heart began to race, her body instinctively tense. He would come in, offer some half-hearted excuse, and go to bed without another word, just like every other night. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, that small spark of resistance burned a little brighter. The door clicked shut with a soft thud as Mark entered the house. Emily remained by the window, her back turned to him, watching his reflection in the glass as he moved through the room. His steps were deliberate, heavy, like he wanted her to hear them, to know he was in control. He didn't speak right away, and neither did she. They had fallen into this routine, silent, tense. It was easier that way, easier to avoid the inevitable conflict that simmered beneath the surface. He walked past her, heading straight to the kitchen without so much as a glance in her direction. The faint clink of a glass and the gurgle of liquid being poured followed, and Emily knew he was helping himself to a drink. It was always like this, an unspoken dismissal. He didn't need to acknowledge her. In his mind, she was a fixture of the house, someone who existed for his convenience, not a person with her own thoughts or feelings. But tonight, that small spark of defiance, the one that had been slowly growing within her, refused to be ignored. The doubts that had crept into her mind over the past few months, the ones she had pushed down, were now surfacing. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that this was normal. She had accepted his lies and manipulations for too long. Emily turned away from the window and moved quietly toward the kitchen. Mark stood by the counter, his back to her as he took a slow sip of whiskey. His posture was relaxed, confident, as if he had nothing to fear. He had no idea that something inside her was shifting, that her obedience was no longer guaranteed. "You're late again," she said, her voice steady but soft. It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't casual either. It was the beginning of something. She wasn't sure what yet, but it was something. Mark didn't even bother turning around. "Work ran late," he replied dismissively, the lie rolling off his tongue with ease. "You know how it is." Her stomach clenched at the familiar excuse. She had heard it so many times before, each time becoming more hollow, more meaningless. For years, she had nodded along, accepting his explanations, convincing herself that maybe she was being unreasonable, that maybe he was telling the truth. But the truth, she knew deep down, was far darker than his words. "I called the office," she said, her voice louder this time, more forceful. She hadn't planned on saying it, but it slipped out before she could stop herself. There was a beat of silence, the air thickening as her words hung between them. Mark froze, the glass in his hand paused mid-air. Slowly, he turned to face her, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. "What did you say?" Emily held her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. "I called your office. They said you left hours ago." There it was, the shift, the moment where she finally stopped pretending. She watched as Mark's face darkened, his expression hardening into a mask of controlled anger. He was good at this, she realized, good at hiding his true emotions behind a facade of calm. But tonight, she wasn't backing down. "Why are you calling my office, Emily?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. It wasn't a question, it was a warning. "For the same reason I've been questioning you for months," she replied, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "Because I know you're lying to me. I know about the late nights, the lipstick on your shirt, the way you avoid looking at me when you come home. I'm not stupid, Mark." His eyes flashed with something she hadn't seen in a long time, fear. For a brief moment, his confidence wavered, and Emily saw it. He quickly recovered, though, stepping toward her with that familiar controlling presence. "You're imagining things again. You've always been paranoid, making up stories in your head because you can't handle the truth. I told you before, don't question me." But something inside her had snapped. The years of being belittled, manipulated, and made to feel like she was the one in the wrong finally boiled over. "No," she said, her voice rising. "I'm done with the lies. I've been done for a long time." Mark stared at her, his face unreadable. For the first time in years, Emily didn't feel small under his gaze. She didn't shrink back. The doubts she had harbored for so long had finally surfaced, and now, they were undeniable. This was the beginning of the end, she could feel it. And as terrifying as that was, there was also a strange sense of relief. She was done pretending. The days that followed the confrontation were different. The air in the house felt heavier, but not in the way it once had. It was tense, sure, but there was something else there now, Emily's quiet defiance. The confrontation hadn't ended with Mark lashing out, as she had feared, but the shift in their dynamic was undeniable. He didn't bring up the conversation again, and she didn't press further. But that moment had planted a seed of change, and Emily could feel its roots spreading through her. For the first time in years, she wasn't walking on eggshells, waiting for his next insult or dismissive remark to tear her down. Mark stayed out later than ever, but instead of dreading the hours of silence and uncertainty, Emily began to savor them. When he wasn't around, she started reclaiming small pieces of herself, pieces she hadn't realized she had lost. One evening, with Mark gone and the children playing quietly in their rooms, Emily found herself in the kitchen, preparing dinner. It was a simple meal, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't consumed by anxiety over how it would turn out. She wasn't preparing it to avoid criticism or trying to meet Mark's impossible expectations. This was for her, and for the children. She stirred the pot slowly, the scent of garlic and onions filling the air. As she worked, she realized how therapeutic it felt, just cooking, without the weight of fear pressing down on her shoulders. When the meal was ready, she called the children to the table, and they sat together, sharing stories from their day. Emily listened, truly listened, to their laughter and innocent chatter. Her son, Ethan, spoke about a new game he had played with his friends, while her daughter, Lily, proudly displayed a drawing she had made at school. Emily smiled warmly, her heart swelling with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. These moments, these simple, precious moments, were hers. She didn't need Mark's approval to enjoy them. She didn't need his validation to know she was doing something right. The children were happy, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, so was she. As the days passed, these small victories began to pile up. Each one was a quiet rebellion against the life she had been living. The once overwhelming fear of Mark's judgment began to shrink, replaced by something far more powerful, self-assurance. Emily found herself doing things she had long stopped doing. She played music while she cleaned the house, humming along to the melodies without worrying about whether the noise would irritate him. She took walks with the children in the afternoons, breathing in the fresh air, letting the sun warm her skin as they laughed and played in the park. She also began to pay more attention to her own needs, something she had neglected for years. She picked up a book she had been meaning to read but never found the time or energy for. At night, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, she would curl up in bed with the book, losing herself in its pages. It felt indulgent, almost rebellious, to allow herself this time, but she didn't care. This was hers, a small but significant way of reclaiming her life. One afternoon, as she was folding laundry in the bedroom, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. She paused, staring at her reflection for a long moment. The woman staring back at her was different, still tired, still worn from years of emotional strain, but different. There was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. She wasn't the weak, incompetent woman Mark had convinced her she was. She was capable. She was strong. That night, when Mark finally came home, his usual scowl in place, Emily didn't rush to greet him. She didn't ask where he had been or why he was late. She didn't apologize for the dinner that had already been eaten, the dishes that were already washed and put away. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, calm and composed. Mark noticed, of course. He noticed everything, but he said nothing, only shot her a look as he made his way to the bedroom, the tension between them palpable but unspoken. Emily watched him go, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. This was a victory, and she was just getting started. Emily woke early, well before the sun had risen, while the house was still draped in the quiet calm of pre-dawn. The children were fast asleep, their rhythmic breathing the only sound in the house. She moved silently through the kitchen, making herself a cup of coffee, her mind already racing through the list of tasks she had set for herself. She had spent weeks mentally preparing, and now, the time had come to act. The small victories she had been accumulating were not enough on their own. As empowering as they weren't going to change her life in the long run. She knew that now. She had come to the painful realization that staying in this house, in this toxic environment, would only continue to erode her spirit. For her sake, and for the sake of her children, she had to leave. But leaving wasn't something she could do impulsively. Mark had made sure of that. Over the years, he had meticulously created an environment where Emily was financially dependent on him. He had control over their money, the house, and even the car she drove. Everything was in his name. She had no savings of her own, no personal resources to fall back on. If she was going to leave, she needed a plan, and she needed to execute it carefully, without Mark suspecting a thing. The first step was financial independence. She had started small, setting aside bits of cash here and there, money from the grocery trips, spare change, anything she could quietly save without raising suspicion. She had opened a secret bank account in her name, something Mark didn't know about. It wasn't much yet, but it was growing slowly. Every dollar she saved felt like a step closer to freedom. The second step was finding a place to go. She had researched shelters for women in abusive situations, but the idea of bringing her children into a shelter frightened her. They had already been through enough, and Emily wanted to shield them from as much of the turmoil as possible. She remembered a conversation she'd had months earlier with an old friend, Sarah, who had mentioned she had a guest room available if Emily ever needed it. At the time, Emily had brushed it off, still too entrenched in her own fear to consider leaving Mark. But now, the idea of reaching out to Sarah felt like a lifeline. That morning, she picked up the phone and dialed Sarah's number. Her heart raced as it rang, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the phone. On the fourth ring, Sarah answered, her voice warm and welcoming, as if they had just spoken the day before. "Emily, how are you?" Sarah asked cheerfully. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Sarah, I need your help," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need a place to stay. It's not safe here anymore." There was a pause on the other end of the line, but only for a second. Then Sarah's voice came through, firm and supportive. "Of course, Emily. You and the kids can stay as long as you need. Just tell me when." Relief washed over her, and for the first time in a long time, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not ready yet, but soon." They ended the call, and Emily sat in silence for a moment, letting the reality of her decision sink in. She had taken the first step, and there was no turning back now. The third and most difficult step was getting the children ready without alarming them. They were still too young to understand the complexities of the situation, but Emily knew they would sense something was wrong if she wasn't careful. She began to make subtle preparations, packing small bags of their belongings and hiding them in the back of her closet. She framed the change as a fun adventure, telling them they might visit a friend's house for a while. Ethan and Lily didn't ask too many questions, and Emily was grateful for their innocence, though it made her heart ache all the same. As the days passed, Emily continued to play her role as the dutiful wife whenever Mark was around, masking her growing sense of determination behind a veneer of compliance. She couldn't afford for him to suspect anything. If he caught wind of her plans, she knew he would do everything in his power to stop her. But what Mark didn't realize was that Emily was no longer afraid. She had a plan, and soon, she would execute it. Each day brought her closer to freedom. Each night, as she lay in bed next to the man who had once made her feel so small, she reminded herself that the end was near. Soon, she would leave. Soon, she would be free. The evening was unnervingly quiet. Emily moved through the house with careful precision, her movements slow and deliberate. She had done everything to ensure that her plan was in place, and now it was a waiting game. Mark had stayed out late again, but this time, Emily wasn't filled with dread or anxiety. She wasn't afraid of what might happen when he walked through the door. Instead, she felt a steady resolve settling deep within her, a quiet confidence that had been building for weeks. Tonight, she knew, would be different. Tonight, everything would come to a head. It was nearly midnight when she heard the familiar sound of the front door creaking open. The smell of alcohol and the heavy thud of Mark's boots on the hardwood floors filled the house. Emily sat at the kitchen table, a single lamp casting a dim light over her as she waited. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, but her heart pounded in her chest. She was ready for this. Mark entered the kitchen without glancing at her. He headed straight for the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a drink without a word, as if she didn't even exist. Emily watched him, her pulse steady, as she carefully considered her next move. For years, she had let these moments pass, these nights where he treated her like a ghost in her own home, where his presence loomed over her like a dark cloud. But not anymore. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. The sound cut through the silence, and Mark froze, the glass of whiskey halfway to his lips. Slowly, he turned to look at her, his eyes narrowing in confusion. It was unusual for her to confront him like this. For so long, she had avoided conflict, but tonight, she stood firm. "We need to talk," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. Mark let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head as if dismissing the very idea of a conversation. "Talk about what?" he said, taking a slow sip of his drink. "About how you're being paranoid again? About how you think you know everything?" "I'm not being paranoid," Emily replied, stepping closer. "I know what you've been doing. I've known for a long time." Mark's expression hardened. He set the glass down on the counter with a loud clink and squared his shoulders. "And what exactly do you think you know?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Emily's heart raced, but she didn't back down. "I know about the affairs," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I know about all the nights you spent with someone else, lying to my face, making me feel like I was losing my mind. But I'm not losing it, Mark. I see everything now. I stayed quiet for too long." For a moment, the room was suffocatingly still. Mark stared at her, his face unreadable, but Emily could see the flicker of anger in his eyes. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, and it unsettled him. She had never stood up to him before, and now that she was, it was throwing him off balance. "And what are you going to do about it?" Mark finally spat, his voice rising. He stepped closer, trying to intimidate her, but Emily didn't flinch. "You think you can just walk out and leave? Where would you even go? You have nothing without me, Emily. You've never been anything without me." That was it, the moment when everything fell into place for her. His words, meant to tear her down, instead gave her strength. She had feared this exact confrontation for so long, but now that it was happening, it didn't feel as terrifying as she had imagined. It felt liberating. The truth was finally out in the open, and there was no more hiding. "You're wrong," Emily said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been more than you've ever let me be. And I'm leaving, Mark. I've already made plans, and I'm taking the children with me." The shock that flickered across his face was almost satisfying. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in their marriage, Mark looked powerless, and it was clear that he hadn't expected this. Emily saw the fear in his eyes, the realization that he had lost control. "You can't leave," he finally growled, stepping closer. "You won't survive without me." But Emily shook her head, standing her ground. "Watch me," she said softly, her voice full of the quiet strength she had been building for so long. She turned away from him, leaving him standing there, stunned and furious, as she walked out of the kitchen. In that moment, Emily knew this was the end of the life she had known, and the beginning of something new. The confrontation had been inevitable, but now that it was over, she felt lighter, freer. She had won the first battle, and there was no turning back. The morning light streamed through the curtains as Emily quietly moved through the house. The confrontation from the night before still echoed in her mind, but now there was no room for fear, only action. She had said the words that needed to be said, and now she had to follow through. The tension in the air was thick, but Emily knew that if she delayed any longer, she risked giving Mark the chance to tighten his grip on her life. He had left early, barely speaking a word to her or the children, but his anger had been palpable. Emily could feel it simmering just below the surface, threatening to erupt at any moment. She didn't have much time, and she knew it. Every second in the house felt like borrowed time, a countdown to the inevitable explosion of Mark's fury. But she was ready. The children were still asleep, unaware of the storm brewing in their home. Emily took a deep breath and began the careful work of packing. It had to be subtle, just the essentials, things she could take without raising suspicion if Mark returned earlier than expected. She had already hidden a few bags in the closet, but now she needed to make sure everything was in place. Her heart pounded as she went through the routine, folding clothes into small, neat piles and tucking them into the bags. It felt surreal, this quiet, methodical preparation for a life she had never truly imagined she would live. For so long, she had convinced herself that leaving was impossible. But now, with each item she packed, the future felt more tangible, more within reach. Her fingers lingered on a small framed photo of her children, Ethan and Lily, smiling brightly on a family trip years ago, before things had taken such a dark turn. They looked so happy, so carefree. A lump formed in her throat as she stared at their innocent faces. She knew this decision was the right one. She was doing this for them, for their future. They deserved a life free from fear, free from the emotional weight Mark had placed on all of them. Once the bags were packed and hidden, she moved on to the next step of her plan, securing a way out. Sarah had been a lifeline, offering her and the children a place to stay, but Emily needed to make sure everything was set. She couldn't afford any last-minute obstacles. Picking up her phone, she dialed Sarah's number, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the phone to her ear. "Emily?" Sarah answered after just a few rings, her voice filled with warmth and concern. "How are you holding up?" "I'm ready," Emily replied, her voice steady. "It's time. I need to leave today." Sarah didn't hesitate. "I'll be here whenever you need me. You just say the word, and I'll come get you." Relief flooded Emily's chest. "Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to leave this afternoon. I'll call you when we're ready." After hanging up, Emily stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen, the weight of her decision settling in. This was really happening. There was no turning back now, and the thought both terrified and exhilarated her. She had spent so long living in fear of Mark, but today was different. Today, she was taking control. Her mind raced through the final details. She would pick up Ethan and Lily early from school, before Mark had a chance to return home. They wouldn't question it. They trusted her completely. She would explain everything once they were safely with Sarah. She could already picture the look of confusion on their faces, the questions they would ask. But eventually, they would understand. They were too young to grasp the complexities of what had happened between their parents, but they would feel the difference in the new life she was offering them, a life without fear or anger hanging over their heads. The hours ticked by slowly as Emily waited, every sound in the house making her heart skip a beat. She knew Mark could come back at any moment, and she had to be ready. She moved quickly but calmly, checking her bags one last time, making sure everything was in place. The clock on the wall seemed to taunt her with every passing second. Finally, the time came. Emily gathered the last of her belongings, taking one last look around the house. It was strange, the attachment she felt to this place despite all the pain it had held. This had been her home for so many years, the place where she had built a life, raised her children. But now, it felt like nothing more than a prison she was finally breaking free from. With a deep breath, Emily shouldered the bags, her heart pounding in her chest as she prepared to leave. The children would be home soon, and they would be safe. That was all that mattered. She glanced at the front door, her path to freedom, and took the first step toward her new life. The air felt different as Emily walked toward the school. It wasn't just the mild warmth of the afternoon or the breeze that tugged at her hair. It was something deeper, a sense of impending change, of finality. Every step she took felt heavier, filled with the weight of the decision she had finally made. She clutched her car keys tightly in her hand, her heart pounding in time with her hurried footsteps. The plan was simple, yet its significance was monumental. Pick up Ethan and Lily, explain as much as she could without overwhelming them, and leave before Mark had a chance to realize what was happening. She had already mapped out the route in her head, every turn and side street memorized to avoid running into him by chance. Sarah was waiting, just a short drive away, ready to welcome them with open arms. As Emily approached the school, she could see the children playing in the yard, laughing and running, completely unaware of the storm that had been brewing in their lives. She watched them for a moment, her chest tightening with a mixture of love and guilt. They had no idea how much their lives were about to change. Ethan was the first to spot her. His face lit up as he waved excitedly, and Lily quickly followed, rushing toward her with her backpack bouncing on her small shoulders. "Mommy!" Lily called out, her smile wide and carefree. "Hi, my loves." Emily greeted them warmly, kneeling down to their level as they approached. She wrapped them both in a tight hug, breathing in their familiar scent and holding them close for a moment longer than usual. It took everything in her not to break down right there. This wasn't the way she had envisioned changing their lives, but it was the only way to keep them safe. "Why are we leaving early?" Ethan asked, his curious eyes studying her face. "Is something wrong?" Emily forced a smile and smoothed Ethan's hair. "We're going on a little trip, just for a while," she explained gently, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'll tell you more once we're in the car, okay?" Lily, always the more observant one, gave her a quizzical look but didn't question further. Emily could tell her daughter sensed something different in her tone, but Lily simply nodded and took her mother's hand. They piled into the car, and Emily strapped them in, her hands trembling slightly as she clicked the seatbelts into place. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was it. Once they left the school parking lot, there would be no turning back. She glanced at the rearview mirror, catching Ethan and Lily exchanging looks of excitement and curiosity. They trusted her completely, and that trust gave her strength. As she pulled out of the parking lot and turned onto the main road, Emily began to speak. "I know this is happening fast, and it might seem a little scary," she started, keeping her eyes on the road. "But I need you both to listen carefully. We're going to stay with Aunt Sarah for a little while, okay? It's going to be an adventure." "Why?" Lily asked from the back seat, her small voice laced with confusion. "What about Daddy?" Emily's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The inevitable question had come, and she had to tread carefully. She couldn't tell them everything, not yet. They were too young to understand the complexities of what had happened between her and Mark, too innocent to know the weight of the emotional abuse she had endured. "Daddy's going to stay at the house for now," she said softly. "But we're going to take a little break, just the three of us. It'll be fun. We'll be safe, and we'll be together. That's what matters, right?" Lily seemed to accept the answer, though she was clearly still processing it. Ethan, ever the protector, looked out the window, his small brow furrowed as he thought. "Is Daddy mad?" he asked after a moment. Emily's chest tightened again. "No, baby. Daddy's not mad at you. This is just something Mommy needs to do, okay? It's going to be all right." The rest of the drive passed in silence, the children quietly looking out the windows as Emily navigated the familiar streets. Her heart raced with every turn, but as they neared Sarah's house, a sense of calm began to wash over her. This was the right choice. She was doing what she had to do to protect herself and her children from a life of fear. When they arrived, Sarah was already waiting at the door, her face etched with concern but filled with warmth as she welcomed them inside. Emily exhaled deeply as she stepped out of the car, the tension finally beginning to ease from her shoulders. As they walked into Sarah's cozy home, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The house was filled with light, warmth, and the unmistakable feeling of safety. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that they were going to be okay. This was the day of freedom. They were finally free. Emily woke up the next morning to the soft sounds of birds chirping outside the window. The room was unfamiliar, but the air felt lighter than it had in years. She blinked, taking in the gentle morning light filtering through the curtains of Sarah's guest room. It took her a moment to remember where she was, safe, in a new place, far from the suffocating tension of her old life. A wave of relief washed over her as she stretched out in the bed, her body slowly relaxing after the whirlwind of the last 24 hours. She glanced over at the children, still fast asleep in the twin beds on the other side of the room. Ethan was curled up under his blanket, while Lily had kicked hers off in her usual restless sleep. Watching them, Emily felt a surge of love and protectiveness. This was why she had done it, for them. Their lives were going to be better now. She would make sure of it. Quietly, she slipped out of bed, careful not to wake them, and made her way into the kitchen. Sarah was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee in hand. Her face lit up when she saw Emily, and she gestured to the pot on the counter. "Coffee's fresh," she said warmly. "How are you feeling?" Emily poured herself a cup, wrapping her hands around the warm mug as she sat down at the table. She took a deep breath, unsure how to even begin answering that question. "Relieved, I guess," she said finally, though the word didn't quite capture the complexity of her emotions. "Scared, too, but mostly relieved." Sarah nodded, her expression understanding. "It's a big change, Emily, but you did the right thing. It's going to get easier from here." "I hope so," Emily replied, taking a sip of the coffee. The warmth spread through her, grounding her. I'm trying to take it one day at a time. I don't want to think too far ahead, you know? Right now, it's just about getting through today." Sarah reached across the table and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're stronger than you think. You've already made it this far. Whatever comes next, you can handle it." Emily smiled weakly, grateful for Sarah's support. But even as she nodded, her mind was racing with worries about what lay ahead. There were still so many unknowns. What would Mark do when he realized they were gone for good? Would he try to track them down? Would he try to fight for custody of the children? The thought made her stomach turn, but she forced herself to push it aside. She couldn't let fear control her anymore. The sound of small footsteps padding down the hallway broke the silence. Emily looked up to see Lily, her hair messy from sleep, rubbing her eyes as she wandered into the kitchen. "Good morning, sweetie," Emily said softly, motioning her over. Lily climbed into her lap, resting her head on Emily's shoulder. "Are we still at Aunt Sarah's?" Lily asked sleepily. "We are," Emily replied, smoothing Lily's hair. "We're going to stay here for a little while, okay? Until things settle down." Lily didn't seem too concerned. She simply nodded and snuggled closer, comforted by her mother's presence. Emily felt a pang of guilt for not being able to explain everything to her daughter, but she knew it was for the best. Ethan, on the other hand, was more observant. He entered the kitchen a few moments later, his expression serious. "Mom, are we going back to the house?" he asked quietly, standing by the doorway. Emily's heart sank. She had known this question was coming, but she still wasn't sure how to answer it. "Not right now," she said carefully. "We're going to stay here with Aunt Sarah for a while, okay? It's safer this way." Ethan stared at her for a moment, his brows furrowed in confusion. He was old enough to sense the tension, old enough to know that something big had changed. "Is it because of Daddy?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily felt her throat tighten, but she met his gaze. She couldn't lie to him, not anymore. "Yes," she said softly. "Daddy and I need some time apart. But it's not your fault, Ethan. None of this is your fault. We're going to be okay. I promise." Ethan didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, slowly, he walked over and hugged her tightly. Emily closed her eyes, holding him close, feeling the weight of his small body against hers. She had done the right thing. She had to believe that. As the day stretched on, the reality of their new life began to settle in. There were still many uncertainties, but for the first time, Emily felt like she could breathe. She wasn't trapped anymore. The future, though still unclear, felt like something she could shape, something she could control. And that, she realized, was the first step toward her independence. It had been a week since Emily and the children had moved into Sarah's house. The days had passed in a strange blur, half relief, half tension. Sarah's home was warm and welcoming, and the children had quickly adjusted to the new environment, treating it like an extended vacation. But for Emily, the reality of what she had done, what she had left behind, lingered in every quiet moment. She spent her days trying to keep busy, taking care of Ethan and Lily, helping Sarah with household chores, and trying to focus on the present. But no matter how much she tried to stay occupied, the looming thought of Mark was always in the back of her mind. She knew he wouldn't let this go. It was only a matter of time before he made his move. The call came late one afternoon, just as Emily was preparing dinner. The familiar sound of her phone vibrating on the countertop sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She glanced at the screen and saw Mark's name flashing. Her heart pounded in her chest, her palms suddenly slick with sweat. She knew this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. For a brief second, she considered ignoring it, letting the call go to voicemail. But she knew that wouldn't solve anything. She had to face him sooner or later. With a deep breath, Emily picked up the phone and answered. "Where are you?" Mark's voice was cold, sharp. No greetings, no pretense of concern, just raw, simmering anger. "I'm not coming back, Mark," Emily said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through her veins. "We're staying here with Sarah. It's over." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and when Mark spoke again, his tone was darker, more menacing. "You think you can just take my kids and disappear? You can't hide from me, Emily. You've made a huge mistake." Emily gripped the phone tightly, her knuckles turning white. "I'm not hiding," she replied firmly. "I left because I couldn't live like that anymore. I couldn't let our children grow up in that environment. You know this isn't about them. It's about us." "You don't get to make that decision," Mark snapped. "You're nothing without me. You never were. What do you think you're going to do? Raise them on your own? You can't even take care of yourself." The familiar sting of his words hit her, but this time, something had changed. She wasn't the same woman who had cowered under his control for so long. She wasn't afraid anymore. His words didn't have the same power over her as they once did. "You're wrong, Mark," she said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "I am not nothing. I've always been more than what you made me believe, and I'm going to be just fine without you." There was a pause, and for the first time, Mark sounded genuinely rattled. "You're going to regret this, Emily," he spat. "I'll fight for custody. You won't take my kids away from me." "I'm not taking them away from you," Emily replied, her heart pounding. "You can see them, but we're not coming back to that house. You need to understand that." But Mark wasn't listening. His voice was laced with fury as he continued to threaten her, talking about lawyers, court battles, and how he would make her life hell. Emily could feel the tension rising, the familiar fear creeping in as his anger boiled over. But instead of letting it consume her, she took a deep breath and calmly said, "I'm not going to argue with you, Mark. I've made my decision, and I'm not changing my mind." She hung up before he could respond, her hands shaking slightly as she set the phone down. The room was quiet, except for the soft bubbling of the pot on the stove. Emily closed her eyes, taking a moment to steady herself. The conversation had been as hard as she had imagined, but it was done. She had stood up to him, refused to let his threats pull her back into the life she had escaped. When she opened her eyes, she saw Ethan standing in the doorway, his face pale, eyes wide with concern. "Was that Daddy?" he asked quietly. Emily nodded, walking over to him and kneeling down to his level. "It was," she said softly. "He's upset, but it's going to be okay." Ethan looked at her with worried eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is he mad at us?" Emily's heart broke at the question. She pulled Ethan into a hug, holding him tightly. "No, sweetheart, he's not mad at you. None of this is your fault. Daddy just needs some time, but we're safe here, okay? I promise." Ethan clung to her for a moment before nodding slowly. Emily kissed the top of his head, grateful for his quiet strength. She would protect him and Lily at all costs. Whatever came next, she was ready. As she stood up and returned to the kitchen, Emily realized that this was the final challenge. Mark wouldn't let go easily, but she had found something stronger than his threats, her own resilience. And with that, she knew she could face whatever came next. The days following the phone call with Mark passed more peacefully than Emily had anticipated. There had been no sudden visits, no unexpected legal papers, and no more threats. It was as though the conversation had been a final outburst, and now the dust was beginning to settle. For the first time in years, Emily felt like she could breathe without fear of what might come next. She had always known that this transition would be difficult, but what she hadn't expected was the growing sense of peace that came with it. The constant weight she had carried for so long, the fear, the doubt, the shame, was lifting, little by little, with every new day. She still didn't have all the answers, but she had something far more valuable, hope. One morning, she sat on Sarah's back porch with a cup of coffee, the sun warm on her face as she watched Ethan and Lily play in the yard. Their laughter filled the air, carefree and light, and Emily smiled as she took in the scene. This was what she had fought for, the chance to give them a life free from the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over their home for so long. Sarah joined her on the porch, sitting down with a cup of her own. "You seem more relaxed," she observed, her voice soft and kind. I think I am, Emily admitted, still watching the children. It's strange. I thought I'd be more worried, especially after the call with Mark, but I don't know, I feel lighter somehow. You should, Sarah replied. You've made some huge steps, Emily. You're taking control of your life. That's not easy, but you've done it. Emily nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. It's funny, she said after a moment. For so long, I thought I needed him. I thought I couldn't do anything without him. But now that I'm here, away from him, I realize how much stronger I am than I ever gave myself credit for. Sarah smiled. I knew you were strong the whole time. You just had to see it for yourself. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the children chase each other around the yard. The simplicity of it all, the sun, the laughter, the warmth of friendship, felt like a gift, a reminder that life could be beautiful and full of possibility, even after so much pain. As the days turned into weeks, Emily slowly began to rebuild her life. She reached out to an attorney to ensure everything was in place for her and the children. Mark had not made any more moves since their last conversation, but Emily wanted to be prepared for whatever might come next. She was no longer operating from a place of fear, but from a place of strength and foresight. Her decisions now were for her children and for herself. She also began looking for work, determined to create a stable future for her family. Sarah, ever the supportive friend, helped her polish her resume and reach out to old contacts. Emily felt a sense of excitement, mixed with nervousness, as she thought about re-entering the workforce. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to dream of a life beyond the walls Mark had built around her. But more than anything, it was the time she spent with Ethan and Lily that brought her the most joy. She could see the change in them already, how much lighter they seemed, how their smiles came easier now. They were still adjusting to this new life, but every day brought them closer together, and Emily cherished every moment. One evening, as she was tucking Lily into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. Mommy, are we going to live here forever? Emily smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face. I don't know, sweetheart, but wherever we live, we're going to be together. That's what's important. Lily nodded thoughtfully, then asked, Is Daddy still mad? Emily's heart clenched, but she kept her voice calm. Daddy might be upset, but that's something he has to work through. It's not your job to worry about that, okay? Your job is to be a kid, to have fun and be happy. I'll take care of the rest. Lily seemed satisfied with that answer, and soon her eyelids drooped as she drifted off to sleep. Emily sat beside her for a few more moments, watching her daughter breathe softly, marveling at how much had changed in such a short time. Later that night, Emily found herself back on the porch, looking up at the stars. The quiet of the night wrapped around her, but instead of feeling lonely, she felt at peace. She had come so far from the woman she had been just a few weeks ago. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but she had faced them all with courage and resilience. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to think about the future, not with dread or uncertainty, but with hope. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. And that, more than anything, was what gave her the strength to keep moving forward. She was free, and the rest of her life was just beginning.